Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I love the fact, if you listen to the current Labour government, they're talking about growth, investment, markets, capital markets, and things. And they do need to do those things to help it recover. If they didn't do those things, no, I think it'll become more permanent. And a lot of people, they go to the United States, there's more liquidity.
Jamie Dimon, the boss of America's largest bank, saying that Britain needs to shape up or face permanent decline as a financial centre. You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Now, global investors are supposed to be coming to Britain next Monday for the Chancellor's big summit. And Jamie Dimon isn't one of them. Instead, he met Rachel Reeves this week and then gave Bloomberg's Lisa Abramovich that exclusive interview you just heard there. And it sums up a lot of what people in the city are saying. Labour's got big plans, but needs to deliver on them. The vibes are good, but we want detail.
Yeah, well, Rachel Reeves has been meeting with the CEOs of some of Britain's biggest banks today, several of whom are sponsoring her big summit next week. The Chancellor is relying on them to drive growth and help crowd in global investment. But the financial sector, including the City of London, is also an easy target for tax hikes. And there is a lot more sympathy for pensioners than there is for bankers. Well, let's dig into Labour's plans for the city and the wider financial services sector. Our City Editor Katherine Griffiths is here with us in the podcast studio. Katherine, let's start with the problem. What state are London's financial services in at the moment? Do they need a bit of intervention like Jamie Dimon is proposing?
In many ways, they're in a good state. The banks are very profitable, which leads to your point you just made about how, in fact, they might be taxed by the government, which is looking for money. But yes, fundamentally, Jamie Dimon does put his finger on it, that it's a question of liquidity. And London has been losing liquidity for, a long time. This whole business about sort of huge pension funds that we have here in the UK, it's a huge savings market. But for a whole range of reasons, a lot of that money, which used to be invested in UK companies, is now invested basically in government debt. So there are all sorts of sort of ideas for how to get round that, to tackle that problem. And this new Labour government certainly can see that problem. And what they're doing really, in a nutshell, is carrying on with what the Tories were planning to do, which is some capital markets reforms, making it easier for companies to list in London, and hoping that, well, as Jeremy Hunt actually once said, they can kind of create the NASDAQ of Europe.
And it's just worth underlining something you mentioned there, that the lack of investment by pension funds in UK equities is quite something, isn't it? Because if you look around the world, most pension funds are invested in their local markets, aren't they? And I forget the exact number, but the share of British pension money in UK equities is tiny, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And that is definitely a problem that can be tackled. And so we're seeing lots of sort of change to the pensions market, reflecting people's lives and demographic changes. But essentially, the future is about people having what we call defined contribution pensions. That's money that they build up over time rather than a sort of promised fixed amount at the end of their career. And how you get that defined contribution money into these UK sort of or productive assets in this country. The problem, though, it is fraught because ultimately you want people to have enough money to live on when they're old. So you don't necessarily just want to sort of ideologically pump this money into UK things if, it's going to be a range of dud investments, because then you've got a problem of pensioner poverty down the line.
OK, so Labour spent ages on the smoked salmon and scrambled eggs offensive, wooing business. Do we know more now about what they were pledging to do for banks?
So they do like a bit of smoked salmon offensive. They like to talk about how they love profits and how it's all about opportunity. And then we've had a sort of a disconcerting few weeks if you sit there in one of the big banks or indeed anywhere probably in financial services, which is this sort of relentlessly grim narrative about the state of the economy. So now they're trying to sort of, people in banks and asset managers and insurers are trying to sort of work out what this government is really about and what its priorities are going to be. They know that the government is desperate for growth because their own success hinges on it. But how do you get that? And do you say you like the idea of growth? Are you prepared to make the difficult choices that might lead to it? So all sorts of things like, do you have a sort of a wave of deregulation? There's some talk that they might make some big changes to the financial regulators. Could that create some sort of, Big Bang scenario, Big Bang 2? Or do you think, no, actually, that's not really the way to have a sort of high quality, reliable capital market, and therefore you sort of try to tread a line where you do preserve your strict rules and rule of law, the things that the UK and London have been famous for over many years?
But that sounds so conservative. You know, the idea of having another big bang takes me back to the days of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. I kind of
Nigel
wonder,
Lawson.
Well, yeah, but even to have a big bang 2.0, you wouldn't have thought would be a Labour proposal. What's it that the banking bosses actually want from Rachel Reeves? I know that they've been meeting her. Do we know what they've been asking her for?
So I think they, for starters, do not want another bank tax. And I think they are genuinely worried that whether it's with this budget on October the 30th or even after that, next year at some other point, that Labour will come for them with a bank tax. So that's just a sort of starting point. It would be very interesting to know how explicit the conversation will have been with the Chancellor on that topic. But then actually what they really want is sort of policies that will make these sort of dreams that Labour has about greening the economy actually come in, be real. So, for example, Lloyds Bank, which is a sort of huge lender into the UK economy, wants there to be sort of straightforward, clear policies which would actually allow people across this country to sort of have heat pumps in their homes or to be able to use electric vehicles across the country. And if we could have proper policies that will kind of create that infrastructure, the UK banks will then lend into that. They want to be able to lend their huge balance sheets to businesses that can then, bring these things about. So it's about stability, it's about clear policies. There's been a huge focus on housing, of course, and planning. They want to see that this government, rather than having endless internal fights, is sort of seriously focusing on their policies.
You can see how the government fancies its chances taking money from the banks, as the options for taxation are getting so limited for the Chancellor. And as you say, the sector is doing well. More broadly, how do you think that the city feels it's being listened to? During the Brexit negotiations, that there was a sense, I think, in the city that they were slightly abandoned by the government. Do you think the city feels that this government is listening to it?
Yes, certainly. So I think that actually the one thing that Liz Truss did, strangely enough, was to turn back to the City of London and say it was this jewel in the crown, and everyone loved that. And although people might want to sort of dissociate themselves with any dealings with Liz Truss these days, it is undoubtedly the case that was a turning point. And then you had Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt really kind of forging quite good relations with banks and other financial firms, and Labour has obviously seen that as a key priority. But I do think that, particularly since the election, people are quite wary about whether, particularly Keir Starmer, who is really not very interested in the economy, I think most people would agree, what it actually means. Is there a partnership with government, as Labour has claimed there will be, or not?
It's interesting. I feel like there's a parallel here to the relationship with the EU. I was hearing last night the relations with the UK and the EU from Brussels' perspective improved under Rishi Sunak with the Windsor framework. And actually, Sue Gray was doing a lot of the work behind the scenes in the new Downing Street to make the reset of the relationship. And without her, perhaps there might not be as much of a prioritisation of that. But just getting back to the budget and the fears ahead of October the 30th of these tax hikes, Katherine, you wrote this really good big take on how the wealth creators have basically got their bags at the door, worried about a fiscal tightening. Since you wrote that, do you think more wealth creators have packed their bags?
I think the wealth creators are packing their bags and making sure everyone knows that they're packing their bags. And, they're probably a sort of strata of society that is not really accustomed to things not going their way. And also probably make some legitimate points about the wealth and the investment that they bring to the country. But I think it's a difficult choice for this government, which is, after all, a Labour government, to think about how much they need to balance appeasing or being on good terms with the rich people of the city or private equity with all their other priorities. And I suppose ultimately the logical way forward will be, well, what is the actual tax take that they can get through the door as a result of their policies. And ultimately, well, I think going into government, certainly some senior members of the cabinet were ideologically quite committed to going after the likes of private equity people. Certainly Rachel Reeves has been talking about it for a few years. They clearly are going through this quite uncomfortable period of rethinking. Whether or not they do something quite pragmatic and short term for October the 30th because they don't want endless headlines about rich people leaving. But it will be interesting to see in the longer term whether they do seek to sort of, as they put it, close some of these loopholes to create what they might deem to be a fairer society. Yeah,
it does sound like there's a fair bit of pushback in the Treasury that perhaps these measures might end up costing money, in which case, what's the point in doing them? I want to turn to the investment summit next week. There's a bit of a row, or not really a row, but there's an issue with the investment minister, isn't there? Here we are 4 months into the new government.
Why haven't we got one?
4 months into the new government. 3 months, I'm told. And we haven't got an investment minister, and we're just days away from this summit.
What's taking so long, Katherine?
It's just very, very exciting who is going to be the investment minister. If they'd only just sorted this out, in a more timely way, no one would ultimately care that much because, no disrespect to previous investment ministers, they haven't always, been the person that everything pivots on. But I think, yes, people are certainly interested in the fact that it has taken them so long. I think we are led to believe there will be an investment minister imminently. But I mean, even that in itself, at this point, a few days out from this summit, will look a bit silly, quite honestly.
It's basically like an ambassador to the business world, as I remember the last one. Just finally, what's at stake here? If the government says that growth is its number one priority and they're talking about finance as the crown jewels of the UK economy, and they get this right, what could they gain?
I think they could gain... It's about momentum, isn't it? So I think they're desperately keen to find some candidates to list. They would love some sort of fintech or tech business that is a British-born thing to list. And I think they would hope that that would create a sort of a positive narrative that would lead to more listings, and then actually I think that would give that would buoy the UK stock market, and everyone would start to think this is fantastic. Britain is the place to be. But they also need to show confidence. Talking to someone who's spent a very long time in banking and is very involved at the moment with some of this work, and they were saying that the UK has an awful lot going for it. Obviously, it's the rule of law, it's got great time zones, it's got fantastic universities, and supposedly it now has a stable government that believes in a good relationship with Europe and all sorts of positive things. It believes in the rule of law internationally. So actually projecting that confidence and optimism could be a moment where the UK could finally perhaps come out from the sort of wrangles of Brexit and the all sorts of uncertainty around the world and say, here we are a great place, we are a great choice for investors, and that could maybe be a compelling argument.
Shoulda, woulda, coulda. Let's see on October the 30th. Katherine Griffiths, we thank you for your analysis. Katherine is our City Editor with us in the studio, but that's all we've got time for today.
If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and our audio engineer was Sean Glastamacchia. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Yuan Potts. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.